Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, everyone. It's a pleasure to be with you here again at the 2021 SIPRI Virtual Forum. My name is Sanam Angelini. I'm the founder and CEO of the International Civil Society Action Network and the director of the Women, Peace and Security Center at the London School of Economics. And it's a real pleasure to be here today with my friends and colleagues at UNDP who are co-hosting the session at SIPRI and my amazing panelists who are going to be talking to us about the latest nexus or set of issues that are sort of challenging us in this century of ours. The conversation today is going to be around the nexus of climate change, climate security, and threats that are arising and emerging as a result of climate change, and how that weaves into, or how these issues are being used, exploited by armed actors, and specifically by violent extremist movements in the various places that we are that we'll be talking about. Within that context, we will be looking at the gender dimensions in terms of how and why women and men's vulnerabilities are increasing or not vis-a-vis the rise of climate change, displacement, and the ways in which violent extremist movements are exploiting these issues, as well as the roles and contributions that they're making. If for more information on these issues, please do check the UNDP website. There are numerous reports on there on the nexus of climate and violent extremism, as well as other really interesting reports on things like behavioral science and violent extremism, or the one that we did in 2019 on invisible women, the gender dimensions of return and rehabilitation. All of these issues kind of feed into each other, and it requires us to take a more holistic approach to thinking about both the threats that we have, but also where the opportunities are, and where and how people on the ground are dealing with these issues because they have to, because they don't have an exit strategy, because it is their lives, their livelihoods, and their families. So really bringing the human dimension of these challenges to the fore. With that, I'm going to start our panel, and it's a real pleasure again to see my friend and colleague Osaka Okai, who is the Assistant Secretary General at UNDP, the Director of the Crisis Prevention Bureau, and I'm sure, Osaka, it has been a very busy year for you. So thank you for joining us, and I hand the floor over to you to sort of set the stage up in terms of where we're going with these conversations. Thank you so much. I'll go on mute.
Thank you, Sanam. Distinguished panelists, participants, and partners from around the world, welcome to this event. Allow me to thank SIPRI and the Swedish Ministry for Foreign Affairs for supporting this critical discussion, and our distinguished speakers for joining us today. Climate risks, as you said, Sanam, when interacting with crisis and conflict and activities of violent extremist groups, heighten security concerns. Natural resource constraints and related grievances that can be aggravated by climate change and COVID-19 can provide fertile ground for violent extremist organization to attract vulnerable populations. And then we look forward to hearing the specificity of such an incident. And then our report, as you said, Sanam, we recently released two reports, policy brief on the climate security nexus and the prevention of violent extremism, one we can share in chat box, and recent research on climate change and violent extremism in Africa, which will be featured soon in one of our events. There is an imperative to holistically consider this risk landscape. UNDP's solution is twofold. First, integrating climate consideration into the PBE analysis and actions. And second, understanding climate action as part of an comprehensive approach to prevention, sustaining peace, and human security. And UNDP is uniquely positioned to deliver these shared solutions. Many might know already, but the UNDP's climate promise on nationally determined contributions under the Paris Agreement is the world's largest offer of support for the enhancement of countries' climate pledges. UNDP is the biggest implementing partner within the UN system for major global funds such as the Green Climate Fund and the Global Environment Facility. And at the same time, UNDP works in 34 countries to implement the prevention of violent extremism programs firmly grounded in human rights principles. UNDP's work on climate security focuses on making all climate prevention and peace building work climate risk informed, as well as ensuring that the climate mitigation and adaptation work is peace positive, that goes beyond do no harm. And furthermore, the climate security mechanism was established in 2018 by UNDP, Department of Political and Peace Building Affairs and UN Environment, with support from Sweden, and later joined by Norway, Germany, and the UK. And the mechanism and the UNDP's other climate security work now serve 25 countries in Latin America and the Caribbean, Sub-Saharan Africa, and the Arab states, while also providing technical support to 8 regional partners entities, including UN peacekeeping and political missions. Bringing our expertise in climate security and PBE together, UNDP is working to shift the discussion from academic debate to identifying good practices and operation responses. UNDP's policy brief that I just talked about on climate security nexus and the PBE highlights 3 flagship field interventions. First, in Sudan, UNDP integrated climate security considerations into analysis of conflict and into community stabilization effort in Darfur. Second, in Central Asia, we supported a regional assessment which helped communicate climate change and security implications to policymakers and inform the design of proposal focused on the Fergana Valley. And thirdly, in Iraq, UNDP and its partners deployed innovative off-grid solar solutions for returnees in the Mesopotamian marshes. It is addressing push factor of violent extremism by strengthening livelihood, diversification, social cohesion, and stability. And our most recent work stream is to better address the intersection of climate vulnerabilities and the root causes of violent extremism through behavioral science. Last week, UNDP launched a step-by-step guide for practitioners to make use of behavioral science to address violent extremism. Experience shows that the application of behavioral sciences will increase and broaden whole of society impacts, including youth and women. There's still more work to be done, though. For instance, UNDP support the development of the prevention of violent extremism national plans, but based on the preliminary inspection of the 12 publicly available PBE national action plans as of January this year, none of them address climate change. Building on UNDP's existing toolbox of guidance and practice notes, such as one on the monitoring and evaluation and risk management for the PBE programming, we will explore the development of further knowledge to ensure that PBE initiatives are more sensitive to climate security. As we face an age of compound risk, we need integrated and inclusive conflict prevention and peace building approaches so that we can help build resilience of the communities that we serve. So I look forward to an engaging discussion today and synergy of action ahead. Thank you. Over back to you, Sanam.
Thank you, Asaka. That was really very comprehensive and kind of sets the stage for the conversation, both in terms of the experiences of Iraq and elsewhere, but also just kind of thinking about in terms of there's deeply local, but then there are these global ways that we need to think about. And the peace positive message, I think, is really important, because so often we think about it as we just want to prevent something. But actually, if we think about how do you enable a healthy society and address and provide the resilience and the kind of a lot of the, as I say, the positive aspects, that in and of itself can be an effective way when the challenges and the shocks come, whether it's from climate or for violent extremism or other things. With that, I will now turn the floor or the camera on to Ambassador Mamanuhu, the Executive Secretary from the Lake Chad Basin Commission, an area which right now is really, there's some real kind of challenges. Just last week, I had a conversation with a colleague of ours in Nigeria, and it was a bit devastating to hear that we're now seeing evidence and the language of rustling women. The levels of violence against women have gone up so much in parts of northern Nigeria, and then and kind of the broader areas that we think about. But I'm curious about in the areas of the Lake Chad region, Ambassador Nuhu, what are you seeing in terms of climate and how it's being exploited by violent extremist groups and other groups, frankly, if there are other kinds of groups that are emerging that are violent, and also what kind of framework would be helpful that would be genuinely having impact at the local level, both in the immediate and the long term. The floor is yours.
Thank you very much. Let me first of all express my deep appreciation for the opportunity that you have given me to attend this very important meeting and to make a brief remark with regard to what is going on in the Lake Chad Basin regarding the impact of climate change. Let me start by recalling that the Lake Chad Basin used to be called the breadbasket of the Sahel, a net exporter of food to other areas of the Sahel, and a magnet of sorts that attracted people from far and wide, literally in search of greener pastures. The basin spans 3 climate zones: the Sahel desert climate in the north, the Saharan desert climate in the north, the Sahel in the central Chad with its wet and dry seasons, and the Sudan zone in the south with a hot, wet, dry tropical climate. Now, over the years, the surface of the water of the Lake Chad has been shrinking as a result of several factors, with climate change as the main reason, that is rising temperatures and low and variable rainfall. Around the 1960s, the Lake Chad Basin used to have a surface area of 25,000 square kilometers. It was then the 4th largest lake in Africa. But as a result of 2 bouts of droughts, one in 1972, from 1972 to 1975, it reduced the lake to half its size, to about 10,700 square kilometers. Then the second drought, which took place from 1982 to 1985, reduced it to 1,410 square kilometers, which was just about 5% of its 1963 size and the lowest in 100 years. Now, that caused climate change. That climate change induced this has serious impact on agriculture, cattle farming, and fisheries in the basin. The high level of rainfall variability also posed a risk to production on land that is traditionally farmed through rain-fed agriculture, irrigation, and food recession farming, as well as from pasture land and fishing. Now, the increasing frequency and intensity of extreme events, such as floods and droughts, have led to major displacements among the affected people. Whereas too little rainfall led to failed harvests and damages agriculture, too much rainfall, on the other hand, caused flooding and erodes farmland. The net result of the changes in climate conditions is increased food insecurity, social tensions and poverty, and the increased number of displaced persons among the affected population. While the lake was shrinking, we also experienced population explosion in the area. Around 1991, the population was 22 million. It rose to 7 million in 2002, to 45 million in 2012, and to about 50 million in 2015. That, of course, meant shrinking means of livelihood, shrinking farmlands, shrinking grazing lands, shrinking fishing waters, and of course, shrinking in the trade in the commodities produced by the farms, the lakes, and the pastures. Now, the climate change induced loss of this means of livelihood led to a number of consequences. Increased competition over the dwindling resources, that is farmlands, pastures, and fishing waters. It led to general unemployment in the area, endemic poverty among the people. It also increased human displacement due to the shrinking nature of the lake, especially fishermen from the northern basin, which almost dried up, to the southern basin, which was a bit wetter, and this caused confrontation between farmers and local fishermen. It also led to increased cross-border transhumance, leading to clashes between farmers and herders over cattle movement and destruction of crops. It generally led to youth idleness and frustration, which makes them available for recruitment for terrorism, arms and human trafficking, and other types of smuggling activities across the porous borders of the Lake Chad region. All this happened before it was a prelude sort of to the arrival of Boko Haram ideology. So you can imagine that when Boko Haram ideology was introduced to the area, it met a very receptive society. Disgruntled youth who constitute 62% of the population, they were idle, frustrated. So they were readily embraced Boko Haram ideology, and that is why it is still there. Now, the battle cry of Boko Haram at that time is that if they help them to go and free and capture the cities, all the banks, all the beautiful houses will belong to them. So that has been the battle cry. And then they also convinced them that the various governments, the governments of the 4 riparian countries, were responsible for their predicament. And that is what we have to battle with in the area. As a solution to that, we have introduced the Lake Chad Development and Climate Resilience Action Plan. It is a 10-year multi-sectoral development and climate resilience action plan, which spanned from 2016 to 2025. It has 7 priority themes, which I will very quickly introduce to you here now. Theme number 1 is supporting producers and their value chains to increase productivity and resilience of food production system in the area. That theme has a lot of activities attached to it, including extension services, credit facilities, access to inputs, animal health, and support to producer organizations and value chains. The second theme to combat the situation is securing access to natural resources and managing conflicts. That involves creating a safe and secure environment and improving the coexistence of agriculture, animal husbandry, and fisheries in the same areas in order to prevent conflict, because that was the most common sort of conflict as a result of the shrinking of the lake and desert encroachment. Now, the third theme under this program is improving living conditions through public investment in the area. The fourth one is facilitating transport and trade. And the fifth one is preserving the environmental capital of the lake and its basin. This one involves afforestation and reforestation of the area that has been affected by desertification, soil and water conservation programs. It involves also promoting alternative to wood-based energy, improving the sustainability and profitability of gathering and hunting practices in the area, and protecting the indigenous Kuri cow. Now, the sixth theme is better management of water resources of the basin. Because water is scarce, I believe if water is properly managed, it will also help to alleviate the suffering of the people and reduce the level of insecurity. Now, all this can better be managed through good dissemination of information and improving knowledge and monitoring of the environment, because there is a wealth of knowledge that is available, and the people who should use them are not aware of that. So we felt it is very, very important to introduce a program, part of the program, to include disseminating of knowledge so that people will know how to handle the problems associated with climate change. Thank you very much for giving me the opportunity.
Was the knowledge development, was that the seventh point in the action plan?
Yes, that was the seventh point.
Thank you very much. Thank you. Very sobering. And the fact that this has been a 50-year problem that you have been witnessing really on the ground, and people on the and people there have been witnessing is at this point, I feel like we need to give you all a virtual hug to say, we're so sorry for everything that you're dealing with, and for being with you, at least in solidarity, to try and solve for the future generations. But we'll come back to the conversation in a minute as well. But thank you very much for setting that out. Our next speaker is going to present these issues from the standpoint of a different region, which is Central Asia. And I'm delighted to introduce Chinara Essengul, who is the Central Asia Program Manager for the Peace Nexus Foundation. And Chinara, again, if you could look at it from the angle of Central Asia, but also, you know, how are you seeing the questions around like national action plans and so forth being addressed? And as Asako said, that you know, the national action plans that we've seen so far have really not taken into account the climate change aspects. The floor is yours. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Can you hear? Okay, so I welcome all the participants, and also thank you very much to organizers, to UNDP and CIPRI. It's my pleasure to be here. I guess I think as a representative of a peace building NGO, international NGO, which is Peace Nexus Foundation, let me say just a few words about this organization and then about the context of Central Asia. Peace Nexus works in 4 regions, Western Balkans, Western Africa, Southeast Asia, and Central Asia. And I'm leading the program of this organization in Central Asia. And we work in Kyrgyzstan, in Kazakhstan, and Uzbekistan, in 3 countries out of 5 Central Asian post-Soviet countries. And I guess this topic is quite promising, and I think UNDP picked up a very, very important strategic issue and shift on this nexus between climate security risks as well as violent extremism and overall radicalization of use of people and societies. And according to the statistics, for example, as you may know, and I think maybe for some of participants it will be interesting, in 2019, according to Fund for Peace on the Fragile States Index, the finding is that 70% of the most climate vulnerable countries belong to the most fragile countries. So I would say that Central Asia, I think, is becoming quite fragile in terms of governance, in terms of lack of good governance, in terms of lack of democratization processes. Basically, there are a lot of things ongoing, but also you know that around 3,000 Central Asians joined and supported ISIS when it was quite active. So basically, so let me share with the first point coming from the context, that when we talk about violent extremism, we tend to really see it as a religious extremism, as we were saying, because it was connected to the emergence of this PVE agenda and understanding it as a key issue of peace-building agenda being the violent extremism. So it has been associated with religion, which is, of course, like not the right thing to do, I guess, but this is how it happened to be. But in addition to that, as a Central Asian experts and analytical people and think tanks, they usually also talk about other types of extremism, which is like what we call ethnonationalistic extremism and political extremism. And by political extremism, I mean something which is extremely characteristic to my country, to Kyrgyzstan, because maybe some of you know, who know more knowledge on Central Asia, that we are experiencing several coups d'etats. Political instability is quite serious here in this country. And these political upheavals have been associated with some violence, on open violence, and the losing of human life. So basically, it's a problem between, in terms of issue of governance and how to do the peace building when we are also having a state building and nation building processes after the Soviet Union collapse. That's, I think, specificity of that. And similar to that, it's ethno-nationalism, and maybe some of you heard the very unfortunate news from Fergana Valley that now we are undergoing an open conflict between two countries, Kyrgyzstan and Tajikistan. And it is also linked not only to the border issues, but as you may guess, it's linked to the management of natural resources, including land and water, and the scarcity of those resources, and the demographic increase in the Fergana Valley. So basically, I confirm the classical logic of this nexus, that in Central Asia, the constrained natural resources leading to the lack of livelihood opportunities for people. And there is a result, if to make it very simple and understandable, in a nutshell, people are forced to make a choice. Either they will go for migration, to the forced migration, or they will return to some violent means of survival, including some extremist groups. Not necessarily religious, but including religious groups. So basically, now let me a bit share and start answering to the main questions that has been addressed to me about how much like we can really mainstream the climate risks analysis and response to the PVE plans, policies, and program. Yes, it was right, according to statistics, that PVE programming started earlier in this region. And at that time, and up till now, I would say until now, the climate response, climate action thinking, and this strategic thinking is not yet present in the region. Let me give you, for example, one interesting fact that only yesterday, our president announced a new structure of the government. It was again restructured, and you can see it's the first time within the 30 years of independence of Kyrgyzstan, we have a new ministry, a new structure, which is called the State Committee on Ecology and Climate. It's the first time. So as a result, it's very logical that PVE action plans, violent extremism action plans or programs are not informed with thinking and linking it with climate problems. However, having said that, I still think I would like to share with some of the observations on how this can be done from now on, I would say. For example, in my country or in other countries of Central Asia, which are quite similar to each other in terms of governance and mentality and culture. So first general observation I have is that we should, I guess, first of all, think about linking this PVE, this climate programming to peace building, and only then to the PVE, I would still say so. That, in other words, think about needed changes in our peace building approaches, then narrowing it down to PVE programming. Because let me remind you, dear colleagues who deal with peace building issues and PVE specifically, that a few years ago, when we just started conceptualizing and working on these PVE issues, we had this challenge to make a shift from CT to PVE and CVE. What I mean here is from countering terrorism to preventing and countering violent extremism. And at that time, it was led also, this discourse and frame was led by UNDP. We came up with something like called radicalization leading to violent extremism. So, and radicalization as a process, of course, it has a lot of root causes. It's a very comprehensive process. People don't become radical in one day or in 1 second. So we should think about these root causes and pay more attention to this, to the structural factors, which are deep, and then to proximate factors and triggering factors, and analytically be able to see this interplay between them. And so basically what I'm trying to say, that when we talk to the government, when we bring them some methodologies, when we bring them some like capacity building activities as a development partners, we really need to help them to see this analytically through. Let me give you one example, concrete example that I experienced. When we were helping the, for example, to the Kyrgyz government to work on a violent extremism program in the country, what we experienced is that the difficulty is to differentiate, for example, between PV and CVE, for example. Because as you know, the governments, there are something called security ministries. In Russian, we call it siloviki, and non-security ministries like Ministry of Education, Culture, etc. So our observation that when we will talk about climate risks in the future, we should understand that it is a preventive lens. So we really need to pay attention how we make a more detailed and focused approach when we work with non-security and security structures in the countries. Another observation, now 2 more points and I'm finishing, is that of course we should, as I said, give some analytical instruments, be it for government, be it for UN agencies, be it for civil society organizations. And here I'm speaking on concrete 2 things. First of all, it's a methodology on how to assess climate risk, how to make the assessments of the climate risks, as well as the impact of this climate change on the livelihood of people, which is differentiated by gender and age, as you're asking, because these things are not happening also, unfortunately, it's not differentiated usually, and it should be already installed in methodology level. Also help to build and learn some methodologies in terms of scenario building, as well as understanding the potential choices of people and reacting and adapting policy changes according to those scenarios. And final point, conclusion. As a peace nexus, one good practice we would like to share is that we try to incorporate conflict sensitivity lens into PVE program. And so far it seems to be successful, because UN team in Kyrgyzstan and peace nexus effort to create a learning adaptation strategy for its PVE program has been highly appreciated by Peacebuilding Support Office of PBF. And it seems to be a kind of a very interesting way to look at it. So I encourage that we need to look to the potential of having these learning adaptation strategies, which unite government, civil societies, donors, bring more coordination and adaptation to these programs. Thank you.
Thank you very much. And very much appreciate that framing of going, not just prevention, not just the negative, but what is it that we want? What's the positive that we want? At ICANN, the way that we look at it is, and it's very much learning from the work that women are doing on the ground. We say, it's really about saying, we want to create an environment where there is peace, i.e. non-violence, means of resolving problems, resilience to be able to deal with the shocks, integration of equality as a way of kind of really valuing the equal rights of women, minorities. But then pluralism, that there's pluralistic identities that people have. And when you have extremist movements coming up and trying to elevate one religion or one ethno-national group, you really need to push back against that and have that. So we call it PrEP, but it's really great to hear from you. And we'll come back to your points. I'm going to go next to our colleague in the Philippines, UNDP resident representative, Selva Ramachandran. Selva, we've heard a lot about climate affecting natural resources, and then meanwhile, a boom in population growth, affecting livelihoods, resulting in migration, resulting in kind of people not having choices, and violent groups coming into the mix. And also the role of government in terms of whether they're handling this well or actually exacerbating the problems. Over to you in terms of what you're seeing in the Philippines context, if any of this resonates or you're seeing a different angle on these things. Thank you. Can you unmute?
Yep. Thank you, and I'm so happy to be part of this panel today, although it's getting quite late for me. Yeah, for me, Sanam, what's important is for me, first, it's very important to frame the question. There is no linear relationship between climate security and violent extremism. At least that's how I feel. Hence, in answering the question, it's important to understand the root causes of violent extremism, and in particular, how does climate change and its impact affect the structural issues such as poverty, inequality, land tenure, unbalanced use of natural resources, conflict, displacement, and the linkages of these structural issues for people to join VE group or for being recruited to a violent extremist movement. I see two dimensions of this matter. When climate change affects the livelihoods of people, when there are no jobs and no recourse, people can become easy targets to be recruited and for themselves to be radicalized. The two things that I see. One, some people join violent extremists or militant groups for economic benefits and livelihoods. This could be ex-combatants, youth, young women, even farmers. Two, some others are truly radicalized because of the vulnerabilities, belief in the ideology of violent extremism groups such as ISIS. I'm saying this from my experience working in Yemen, Libya, Sudan, and now in Philippines. And in some of these places, I see the water poverty is a key factor for the Nexus. Anyway, having said that, let me come back to Philippines now. In Philippines, from the climate angle, we see Philippines is in the number 3 spot when it comes to the climate risk index. 47% of the population live in areas where high exposure to climate hazards. Philippines has also witnessed conflict and violent extremism over the past decades, especially in southern Mindanao. It is ranked 10th in Global Terrorism Index. There are several active violent extremist groups in the country. So in that context, in Philippines, what I see or what can we see from the climate security conflict and violent extremism nexus in southern Mindanao, especially Bangsamoro Autonomous Region in Muslim Mindanao, now onwards I'll call it as BAM, which is also a hotspot area for ongoing conflict and violent extremism movement. Again, it's a very fertile area. So the nexus comes into play in this area, and we do see some interesting dynamics coming up. First, climate impact creates security in two critical ways. Unpredictable drought and flooding cause a scarcity of fresh water and arable land, leading to new conflicts over resources in areas where communities have few fallback options and where social cohesion is low. Second, the impact of climate change causes displacement. Again, where local tensions are already high and horizontal violence and land conflicts rampant, the level of insecurity of violence rise due to presence of IDPs and the inability to easily return to their original locations. Climate security will not just derail development, but also peace processes and peace building. In Philippines, the effort to build a lasting peace following a comprehensive accord in 2014 and the establishment of BAM in 2018, after 4 decades of civil war, is already being undercut by climate insecurity. BAM is home to 2 of the country's largest wetlands, the watershed of Lake Lanao and the Ligushan Marsh. As changing water levels, unseasonal floodings, and flash floods and drought have impacted livelihoods, food insecurity have caused internal displacement. These 2 areas have also seen large increase in horizontal violence and violent extremism, including the famous Marawi siege. So there is evidence to show that youth and combatants, ex-combatants affected due to poverty, food insecurity, lack of job opportunities have joined violent extremism movement for economic gains. Some of the youth are pushed to migrate to urban areas. If these youth do not get opportunities over a period, they will be vulnerable for antisocial activities and recruitment. The violent extremist group have exploited grievances arising out of the underdevelopment and marginalization to recruit the disgruntled. I was in BAM last week, and as part of our Women, Peace and Security initiative, I had a very interesting conversation with the women folk, and I directly asked them this question. One, genuinely, I wanted to know from them. 2, as I was preparing for this panel, I wanted to get the view. It's very interesting feedback. Some women are afraid to talk about such subject matter, but some did say that the climate security has a relationship with violent extremism, where young women are also drawn into violent extremist movement. So what can a framework can look like? For me, it's very clear, a standalone approach will not work. It is important to have an integrated framework for conflict prevention and peace building, which also bring violent extremism into it. For me, I don't care what we call it. We can call it human security, stabilization. The term that we use is not important, but the customization of the framework is important, particularly in a country context.
Thank you very much.
Thank
you. Okay,
Yeah.
thank you. And I'm conscious of time, but thank you for that. That doesn't matter what we call it. It has to be contextualized, and it has to be rooted in the local people and young women, young men, fishermen, foresters. It really has to be the human. When we say human security, is the human beings at the center that are living and dealing with and having to cope. And so the kind of integration is, this is not academic when we say it's got to have a gender lens or an inclusivity lens. This is really practical issues that you're seeing. Thank you for that, Salva. I'm going to move on now to our final panelist, talking from the context of the Swedish Foreign Ministry, the Embassy of Sweden in dealing with Somalia, but also with some experience from Afghanistan. Robert Piszkowski, Counselor for Political Affairs, Somalia section. Robert, the floor is yours. Thank you.
Thanks. I think I managed to overcome my middle-aged technical deficiency and unmute. Yeah, I work on Somalia, and I have some previous experience from Afghanistan. And I mean, Somalia is, as you all know, emerging from several decades of conflict, and it's sort of, it depends on how you count it. I mean, it could be 4 decades of conflict or even longer, depending on where you sort of put the starting date and whether you consider it to still be in a full conflict or a civil war or a conflict in certain parts of the country. But it's a very fragile country. And that fragility is made worse by climate, by environmental degradation and climate changes. Somalia is sort of highly susceptible to climate change and extreme weather events, be it droughts, flash floods, erratic rainfalls, sandstorms, dust storms, cyclones, you name it, it's all there. And the coping mechanism of society after sort of 4 decades of conflict, or 3 decades of conflict, depending on how you count, is very, very low. The coping mechanisms are very low. And at the same time, it deepens the existing conflicts. I mean, you have 3 decades of conflict with overlapping layers of local community conflicts that have morphed into sort of national conflicts in various parts of the countries. The federal member states and the federal government, and the climate change deepens these conflicts in many cases. And I mean, it's in some ways it's what we heard from the other panelists. It's sort of if you wish, a traditional competition for scarce resources that are being made worse. We have, I think, the 2 biggest sort of trends, if you wish, that are visible in Somalia is one is the transformation of pastoralist livelihoods, which began sort of sometime in the 70s and 80s. What we saw was actually through aid, there was water resources being made available, so that there was a commercialization of livestock herding, which in turn sort of drove local conflicts that were being manipulated by the then government, and that sort of led, was a major contributing factor to the civil war erupting. But in the long run, that led to overgrazing, huge increases in herds, livestock, and that put huge pressure on these grazing lands and led to their degradation, which in turn then fed new conflicts between various pastoralist groups and clans and so forth over this sort of increasingly scarce resource. The other trend, I think, is the deforestation of Somalia. I think in 1980, about 15% of Somalia was covered by forests, 9 million hectares or so. Today, it's somewhere around 10%, 6 million hectares, and very quickly decreasing. Somalia has a very high level of deforestation, much higher than in the rest of Africa. And all of these changes obviously leads to sort of quite a lot of societal changes, what other speakers have spoken of, loss of livelihoods and so forth. And I think the biggest, visible social change in Somalia is sort of rapid, uncontrolled urbanization. I think today we have somewhere over 2.5 million IDPs. Interviews with them, and it differs depending on where they are. And where they come from, but somewhere between 30 and 50% usually refer to climate change or loss of sort of livelihoods due to environmental degradation being a contributing factor to why they have moved. So it deepens these local conflicts that then in turn drive these sort of societal changes. So I think, from our perspective, the way we see it is that the changing climate and environmental degradation works as a multiplier. It makes already existing trends, political grievances, inequalities, hierarchical structured, patriarchal or gendered, just much worse. It sort of multiplies these various effects, and that makes it very difficult to make a direct link sort of between violent extremism and climate change, but it's sort of there in its interactions with all these sort of factors. And I mean, so Al-Shabaab, which is sort of the biggest armed group and a violent extremist group in Somalia, it doesn't exist because of climate change, but its continued existence is made easier by a changing climate, because it skillfully manipulates these clan conflicts. It takes sides in various conflicts. It recruits and from different clans depending on how the conflicts fall out. And they also use control over resources to try and control populations of various clans. We've seen end of last year, I think it was, when the Somali National Army together with AMISOM was advancing south of Mogadishu and Lower Shabelle. We saw Al-Shabaab, when it was about to lose a village or relent control of a village, actually destroying the wells in that particular village and forcing the villagers to seek water outside of the village, in wells outside of the village. And there, obviously, Al-Shabaab, had control, were erecting roadblocks, harassing the population, forced recruitment, etc., taxation, you name it, while also at the same time, obviously, setting ambushes for the security forces if they, tried to respond and all that. So there's definitely a dynamic there, and also, which was also mentioned by several others, there's the recruitment issue. Because all of these changes obviously creates, larger and larger groups of socially economically marginalized people, usually IDPs who move into the cities. They live in informal settlements because, the economies of the bigger cities are sort of slowly taking off. You have land evictions, you have conflicts, and you have quite a lot of, young men, young people in overall. And the median age in Somalia is 16. So quite a lot of them struggle to find a decent livelihood, and then turning to Al-Shabaab or any other armed group becomes a way of earning a livelihood, and eventually it might also become a way of life, and thus sort of deepening the conflict. Not to say that sort of all young people turn to Al-Shabaab, but it's definitely an issue. So I think, mindful of the time.
Yes,
what we see sort of in Somalia is that climate change acts as a multiplier. Mm-hmm. It exacerbates already existing local conflict over natural resources. It exacerbates clan conflicts, contributes to uncontrolled urbanization, and plays into the hands of various violent groups who sort of exploit them to their own advantage.
Yeah, thank you very much. I think that kind of captures it, that these things are kind of symbiotic in terms of, you may have, and we had a question from the audience saying, what happens when you have natural resource exploitation, which creates a climate problem, where it's deforestation and so forth, and then so you can have the traditional conflict affecting climate, and exacerbating it, or you can have climate resulting in climate change affecting rising conflict. We have a few minutes left. We have a few questions from the audience. One of the questions that comes up is, what, if anything, are you seeing around issues of family planning, birth control, in terms of, all of you have talked about population boom. So I'm going to put the questions out and ask you to answer, just give a couple of minutes each, or you don't have to answer all the questions, but if any of the topics particularly interest you. So there's the question around birth control issues. There's also another question around, are there places and ways in which we can kind of share good practices across countries, across stakeholders? And I think this is a really important question that, it's easy sometimes to throw away the language around, what are women doing, or what are local communities doing, but actually they have a lot of both local knowledge that can be adapted and made available elsewhere, but what are the spaces for really engaging that and looking at kind of and enabling, as I say, the sort of the positive side of the discussions. And then the third question that comes up for me is that all of you touched on the problem of the lack of social cohesion. Now, whether that's between fishermen and farmers, whether that's between internally displaced populations from one rural area to another, or urban migration, right? And how this really is kind of at the crux of a lot of the let's say, foundations for how and why violent extremist movements actually recruit, because they tap into various forms of identity, whether it's religion, ethnonationalism, tribal identity, etc. So are we taking a serious look at, or is there sort of new opportunity for really thinking about the weaving of that social fabric and rebuilding of that state-society contract, but also society-society, community-community contract that needs to happen, so that when you have these voices coming in, at least people have a means of trusting each other rather than trusting the misinformation or the disinformation that's coming at them. So these are three questions: social cohesion, family planning, and stakeholders listening to each other and learning from each other. We'll do, anybody take whichever ones you want. We have about 8 minutes or 7 minutes, and then we wrap up. Thank you very much. Anyone want to go? Yes, please go ahead. Would you unmute? Thank you.
Yeah. Okay. Thank you very much for that question. I will very quickly refer you to the regional stabilization strategy for areas affected by Boko Haram activities. I think it tends to capture most of the questions that that have been asked. This strategy was put together by the Chad Basin Commission with the support of the UNDP and the African Union. Basically, it has 9 pillars. Each of the 4 affected countries has its own strategy. Now, we set up a regional strategy in order to bring them together so that they will have one common strategy that will be easier for everybody to address the problem of Boko Haram. It has nine pillars which touch on most of the subjects that we have discussed today. Pillar 1 deals with political cooperation. Pillar 2 deals with security and human rights. Pillar 3 deals with disarmament, demobilization, rehabilitation, reinsertion, and reintegration of persons associated with Boko Haram. Pillar 4 deals with humanitarian assistance. And Pillar 5 deals with the issue of governance and social contract. And I think there was a direct question about social contract. If we go into the details of that pillar, you can see that we are really addressing that issue. Pillar 6 deals with socio-economic recovery and environmental sustainability, because you have to sustain the environment if the entire program is going to be sustainable, if it's going to make sense. Then Pillar 7 deals with education, learning, and skills, because we believe that in order to reduce poverty in the area, you have to give people some skills, something to do. There is a lot of illiteracy in the area. That is what we are trying to address with Pillar 7. Pillar 8 deals with prevention of violent extremism and building peace. Then finally, Pillar 9, which is an all-encompassing pillar, deals with empowerment and inclusion of women and youth. Yes, women are disproportionately affected by the Boko Haram crisis. On both ends, they are the losers. They get kidnapped by Boko Haram. they bear children for them. When eventually they are released, they face stigma. Their children are called children of Boko Haram. So it is really difficult for women, and that is why we have a full-fledged Pillar 9 to deal with that issue. Thank you. Let me allow the others to speak.
Can I come in? Thanks. Just wanted to say that sort of the issue of sort of sexual reproductive health is sort of a key element in quite a lot of developmental contexts that Swedish Foreign Ministry works in, and Somalia not the least. It's a big part of our aid work in Somalia, but it's also not entirely an easy issue because it is linked to sort of overall educational levels and other sort of factors within the societies, which so in itself, it's probably not going to make, is obviously going to make a difference, but it's not going to make a huge difference for this particular problem. It needs to be comprehensive and part of a larger sort of intervention, which is exactly what we've been talking about. And that sort of leads me on to their point about social cohesion. I think what we're hearing from sort of all of us here is that, the climate change increases all of these social vulnerabilities and breaks down social cohesion, and is made worse, obviously, in places we've gone through previous conflicts and so forth. So I think that the key to addressing sort of this climate security nexus is actually in trying to address the social vulnerabilities, to sort of go one step beyond sort of actually, and I think the only way to do that is sort of by mainstreaming, as has been spoken about by many of the other panelists, that it sort of needs to be mainstreamed into our strategies and approaches. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Anybody? Yes, go ahead.
Yes. This is more on the lessons learned, experience sharing. I think it's a very important point. For me, the regional bodies can play a very important role. Say, for example, for Southeast Asia, the ASEAN can play a very important role because all countries are grappling with this issue. And UNDP or UN agencies can work, and that could be a powerful way of sharing lessons. Even I have a question for Asako as part of my input. I'm not quite sure what's the Office of UN Office for Counterterrorism is doing, because at the global level, there also can be a much bigger platform. I think these are some of the avenues and platform we can look into it for lessons learned and experience sharing as well.
Thank you very much. And I would add to that when we look at the regional and all the different actors, it should be like, what's the community that cares? Whether it's your regional, whether it's your national, whether it's your local civil society, how do we mobilize everybody who cares about these issues to work together, as opposed to sort of siloing or demonizing, because so often civil society right now is being threatened also and targeted and not understood when they get involved in this. Chinara, the last word is yours. And so go ahead. Thank you.
Yeah. Regarding the birth control issues, I guess it's important to understand for Central Asia a bit the modern history of it. You know that we were during the Soviet Union, everything related to religion was prohibited, so birth control was much easier to do. But now, after the countries in post-Soviet time trying to go back to their own identities, including national and religion, and it is linked to Islam and Islamization, it's really difficult to do. That's, if you understand the difficulty of Islamization and globalization taking place in post-Soviet space, you will understand what I mean. And regarding the second, social cohesion, I would just again return it back to you, to the audience, is about exactly social cohesion at what level. Is it, we are talking social cohesion within the country? It's about building the civic identity, not around ethnic identity, if we have a diversity, religion-wise, ethnic-wise, or we are talking about the regional, like Central Asia, like in Europe, we always say the model. So we have a lot of challenges in terms of like where to stop in terms of social cohesion. And it is, of course, linked to how we link it to the climate risks and to what extent the climate risks can be addressed, because we all know that the climate risks are beyond national borders, even beyond regional borders. So it is really challenging conceptually and practically in that sense. Thank you for your questions.
Thank you very much. And we're at time, and I will leave us with one thought, which is that I think across the conversations, we were also implicitly and sometimes explicitly saying that the issue of climate change and really the question of violent extremism should not now be seen as a security militarized approach, right? That's not the direction we wanted to go into, that we're now dealing with it, security as in traditional military security. It's really about genuinely bringing a human security lens, genuinely thinking about social vulnerabilities, and thinking about in terms of the human dimensions of this and the sort of pluralistic dimensions. So let's hope that this is something that we can carry on the conversations with, and also the practical work on the ground. Thank you very much. Thank you to CIPRI and UNDP and to all of our panelists for a really interesting and sobering, as I said, I don't want to say depressing, but sobering conversation. There's a lot to be done, and thank you for all of you who are actually at the forefront of dealing with this work. Hope to see you soon. Thank you very much.